this panel is kind of a response to the fact that we're 30 years out from the signing of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we are in various stages all over the world of where we are with our commitment to that document and to the words of that document. And so this is an opportunity, I hope, to kind of visit where we are now and where we're headed, and what we should be concerned about and talking about and challenging each other as far as that goes. Mick, as you probably know, is the founder and CEO of Strengthening Families for Abandoned Children, which is based in the UK. He's got 30 years of experience as a social worker, and he is a passionate advocate, not just for children, but for families, for vulnerable families, and for family preservation all over the world. So, Mick, you're mic'd, so I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce the rest of your panel, and then I'm going to stop talking.
Okay. Am I on? Can you hear me? First British accent of the day. I'm probably the only one, yeah? Okay, Ellie Oswald. I mean, it's strange because I know all these guys. I've worked with them and I know them really, so... okay. So Ellie works with the Faith to Action Initiative, a coalition of organisations seeking to promote best practices in global orphan care. She has served as missions pastor at Bethany Community Church in Seattle and as part of the World Vision International's Child Protection Technical Team, specialising in community-based care for children deprived of parental care. She has a BA from Pepperdine University and MA in Cross-Cultural Studies and International Development from Fuller Theological Seminary. But I'm already feel outdone by all this qualification stuff already. We've just got the one. Ashley Heiligman, Executive Director, Global Child Advocates. She's a licensed social worker whose passion for child protection moved her to Thailand in 2009. Previously worked stateside with CASA. Who are they? CASA? Okay. And residential treatment centres, and her MSW focuses direct practice with children and families. However, her work in Asia with street children, orphanage, foster care and marginalised communities is what has fueled her passion to see every child grow up in a safe, loving family. Ashley is now the Director of Global Child Advocates, leads an international team of Jesus followers who advocate for the best interests of every child. Jason, on the end. Welcome, Jason. Technical Advisor for Anti-Human Trafficking, the Salvation Army. Jason has been working in mission support for families and children through the Salvation Army for the past 20 years. He has worked at the local, state, training school, regional and international levels of the organisation. Over the last 6 years, he has worked as technical advisor in anti-human trafficking at the Salvation Army World Service Office. His mission has been to support vulnerable children, women and families through community-based programming. His experience started in his own local community and expanded to communities around the world. Currently finishing his second year as a PhD student in International Family and Community Studies, he also holds a Master of Arts in Theology and Master of Public Policy with a focus in international development. Wow, the list gets more impressive, doesn't it? Is this true, by the way? Okay. Karen is the only one I haven't worked with, but I did work with her colleague Phil Dark on the Orphan podcast, so that's where I know you from, Karen. Okay, I've just lost where I put that piece of paper away. Yeah. Dr. Karen Hutchison is a highly specialised licensed clinical psychologist. She works with children and teams from foster care, adoption and various traumas, and is the host of Think Orphan podcast. She's an adoptive mom, orphan care advocate. Dr. Karen provides domestic and international consultation for orphan care communities and member care to individuals and organisations across the globe. And Nicole, Director of Christian Alliance for Orphans. She serves as Director of CAFO's, is it CAFO or CAFO? Sorry. Oh, CAFO. British. Tomato, potato. CAFO's Applied Research and Best Practice Initiative. Prior to this role, she worked as a child and family therapist, missionary in juvenile detention, and with children with special needs. Through her professional and personal life, she has gained extensive experience with foster care, adoption, trauma recovery, transition into family care, OVC research, early childhood development, developing and implementing standards and cross-cultural ministry. Nicole has degrees in psychology, family studies, marriage and family therapy, and permanency and adoption competency. She lives with her family in Peru, where they work to see vulnerable children raised in families. Well, thank you very much for joining us, everyone. Got a very impressive list there. So the future, this session is about the future of global missions in child welfare. So throughout the last 30 years, most countries have signed and ratified the United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child, which seeks to ensure that all children are protected. If I was to ask everyone, do you know what the 12 rights of the children are in that document, I don't think many people would be able to say, yeah, I know what they are. And I certainly couldn't, so I've looked them up. Can I just say that what they are, just so we know when we're looking about what that document, what that policy document actually is talking about, the rights of children? These are the 12. The right to live in a family environment. The right to a stable, loving and nurturing environment. The right to health care and nutrition, the right to clean water, electrical power and a safe environment, the right to a quality education, the right to equal opportunities, the right to guidance from a caring adult, the right to be heard and participate in decisions that affect them, and the right to be prepared for active and responsible citizenship, the right to be protected from abuse and neglect. And I think there's one more, not two, the right to dignity and freedom, and the right to spiritual development. And I think if you just reflect back on that film that we've just seen, just about every one of those rights will have been broken for all of those children and the many more that sit alongside of them. So this is about trying to get your impressions, and I have no idea who wants to go first. Where's the microphone? You have the microphone. Doesn't mean say you have to go first. But I was thinking, so my first, and I'm curious about this. So we're talking about this 30 years United Nations Convention for the Rights of the Child. Do we see that there's a role for global missions actually working with governments globally? Is that something, in your opinion, that we should be doing separately or together with governments from a missions perspective?
Maybe I'll take a crack at that and we can just send this back and forth so
Right.
we have a plan. Does that all sound good? Okay. So I would say a couple of things just to give a smidge more context about the UNCRC. I think I want to address this just from the perspective specifically of the church. And oftentimes there's this interesting animosity or adversarial attitude between the faith-based sector and the public policy sector, including the UN. And I think there are some legitimate concerns people have had over the years, certainly not insurmountable concerns. But we aren't going to do this separately. It's just not going to be effective. It never will be. It's true that we really are better together, and that includes across sectors. So I think as Christians, what we can see the UNCRC as is this extrapolation of what is actually the best available care for kids, and people far more veteran in this field than most of us in this room were brought together to identify, based on the evidence, what kids need to thrive. So sometimes we can come at it from the perspective of, oh, that's just what the UN says. But if we start to explore in Scripture, those things, many of those things, would be outlined there as well. And I think what I would, home in on is specifically that right to family. It's not a suggestion, it's actually a right. And we see that in Scripture as well. So Scripture and science will affirm the same things when it's good science, because it's simply the discovery of God's creation and God's truth. And so as Christians, we can look at that and say, we, more than anyone, should be massively committed to seeing this come to fruition across the world, not because the UN says so, but because God says so, and because we want to be faithful and obedient to that call. And just to answer kind of that part B of the place of global mission in child welfare. Global mission can be a lot of things, but I just want to address this idea of kind of us as maybe Westerners supporting. And I think the place of global mission is for us to come together to support the local church to see this actually happen in their own nations. Just very simply, it's much more complicated in practice. It's possible in practice. We see it happen all of the time. But that's really our role, not to do it, not to be rescuers, not to be saviors, because we're not, but instead to be a support to the local church, to let them walk in the dignity that happens when God is active and moving through them and empowering them, the local church, to be the solution to the issues that they have in their own culture. And it's Ellie's turn.
Yes, amen. Since the CRC, there's other documents that have helped bring guidance around the right to family. The UN guidelines were developed 10 years ago, this next October. And even now, in the next few months, the UN is looking at a resolution that would highlight the progress that has happened in the 30 years and in the 10 years since these guidelines were created, and then actually be able to call out some of those areas where we're faltering, where we're maybe not getting it quite right, and really emphasize those areas. So we're excited about that resolution, and there's been a lot of collaboration around that resolution, and it has highlighted this rift that Nicole kind of referenced, recognizing, the challenge between, I would say a bit of the carrot and the stick, that reference regarding how do you get a horse to run down the racetrack. I don't know, maybe that's the reference, but you can invite them into something, and that's the carrot, or you can hit them and move them forward with this stick. And I think people, if they view kind of this international guidance only as a stick, and it can be a stick. It sometimes is a challenge when a national government, in an attempt to align with international guidance, puts out a memo that says we're going to shut down 300 or 500, and I used to know the exact number, what they did recently in a country I'm not going to mention on a microphone. It's a stick. It's not helpful. It doesn't feel okay. But I think we need to kind of shift our mentality and recognize that we can be the carrot in this. As faith leaders, as Christian organizations, as those who are supporting the local church, to say, as governments are feeling this international pressure to change and to align, we can say, we can come and help. What do you need help with? And we have seen Faith to Action, we don't do any work ourselves. We just get to learn from all of you. So I know a lot of stories of people doing this work, and over I hear when people are successful in engaging with their governments, it's because they've been willing to slow down, to grow their patience, because we all know working with government, my husband works for the government, it takes some patience, but how can we help? And finding opportunities where you can grow, and being given opportunities you never would have dreamed of because you're feeling a need that government has to align with that international pressure. So I think it's a credible opportunity for Christians. I was just talking to someone in Mexico that is saying, wow, the opportunity for Christian foster care in Mexico right now is incredible, because the government is scrambling to figure out how to develop foster care. And if they can raise their hand and say, we've had some experience. Now, this guy in particular has 3 other states that are saying, can you come to my state and do this? So it's a great opportunity. Let's be the carrot for governments to be able to show that they're doing things to align with this international guidance.
I would completely agree with that. And we've seen it in Thailand, where we've been able to work with the government and really support them and even provide education for their own staff and for the other organizations that are locally running shelters. We went through the transition process from children's homes into family-based care, and the government is feeling that pressure, and they have seen that we're making it work, and so now they've asked us to start doing training, and it's a way that we can fill that gap and support them. And then government, even like government officials in Myanmar have been connected with us and then are asking us to do training in the government organizations, the government orphanages that they don't really let anyone have access to. But they know that this is the direction that they're supposed to be moving, and so they've found somebody that knows how it works and that speaks Burmese and that can do that kind of training that they need to see happen. And so I think it is such a great opportunity for us as believers to come and support and create reconciliation between the government and faith-based organizations and within the country's mindset. I think so often that rift is because we fear that the government is going to not allow us to have religious freedom, or we're not going to be able to share our faith with the people that we work with. But we've seen the opposite. We've had God, it's a matter of trusting God that he's going to work out those details and not worrying about what that's going to look like, but just moving forward, being respectful. The governments aren't going away. I mean, the governments, for this to be sustainable, for any of our work to be sustainable, we have to work in collaboration with the government and help the people there in any country work in collaboration with the government. Because if we continue to kind of have this us versus them mentality, it won't work out long term. The government is stronger, and I've heard Ugandan officials say our hand is stronger, so eventually they will conform. And so we have to fall in line there, and it's a way we can bless and really impact more people.
Hi, you guys. Thank you for having me. I echo everything that's been said. Just to kind of add a little bit of background to our story. My family, we used to live in East Africa, and a huge theme in even the podcast that I get to be a small part of is we have to have collaboration. In that, we're modeling and emphasizing connection, which is relationships, which is what we all need. It's what we're all called to, even as believers. God calls us to himself. He calls us to a local body, calls us to each other, calls us to families as brothers and sisters in Christ. But there also has to be an attitude and an awareness of that we don't know everything, and that there has to be a humble mindset to that, especially in international settings. And so if we approach these huge topics that seem too wide and too big to fix or to solve, if we approach that without collaboration, if we approach that with a disconnected mindset, we are not going to be successful, not only from a faith-based perspective, but from a reality perspective. We're not going to reach goals. We're not going to help orphaned and vulnerable children. And so just, again, emphasizing collaboration, that is connection, that's modeling connection for the families or the children that we are working with and serving, and then approaching that from such a humble perspective that we don't know things simply because we are educated or have experience or come from a different part of the country or world.
So going last means that a lot of things have been said already, but we're working, Salvation Army is working in a collaborative effort in the Philippines, and the work has a government partnership. So we work with the government of the Philippines as well as the United States government, as well as multiple other organizations in an effort to protect children who have experienced online sexual exploitation. It's a real issue there right now, and it seems to be a growing issue. What we've learned from that experience is it's often difficult when you work in that many partnerships because there's a lot of transparency, more than even you normally experience. Difficult doesn't mean bad. Difficult means like that's where you learn. So it's been a very positive experience to be in those partnerships, to have accountability. And I think if the best for the child is being thought about, then we want to have the highest level of standards and care, and also availability of options. And that only happens through systems. And systems take place through collaboration. And I guess the other side of that is we've also seen a lot of examples in the Christian church of doing it on our own and not doing it well, and lives are lost through that process, and that even if it's done with good motives and in prayer, it's a bad witness, and it destroys families.
When I asked the question, I added this question to what was down on the list, so I hope you don't mind, because for me, this is key. It is for so many years, I think many of us have heard about churches and missions going it their own way, And actually, I've heard many times mission organisations say, we don't want to collaborate with the government. If we collaborate with the government, they're going to tell us what to do, and we won't be able to hold our Christian standards. Then, well, how on earth are you going to influence? How on earth are you going to show best practice? How on earth are you going to draw them in and have government come to you and say, tell me how you do this, because what you're doing is good, what we're doing is terrible. And I have no idea what you guys were going to say. So, blessed by what you've said.
I have a little story to highlight that.
Oh. Yeah.
So I wasn't planning to share this. Is this going to be posted publicly, by the way? Yes, it will be. Okay, I'll be very
Be anonymous.
I'll be very careful. So last week we had the privilege to speak to the national government of Peru. My family and I work on deinstitutionalization efforts in Peru, as well as working for the Christian Alliance for Orphans. And while we were there, it was, I'm not going to name names. Just imagine kind of everyone in the country that deals with child welfare. And afterwards, we went home and we were just praying about it and asking God to just take these loaves and fishes and multiply it. And my husband came to me and he said, after I was having my quiet time, I just felt like the Lord was showing me that over and over in Scripture, you have these people like Joseph and like Daniel, who are under the leadership of like these really high kings who are not followers of God. And yet through their witness and through their interaction, it says in Proverbs that God can turn a king's heart like he turns the water in a river. And so if we're able to be faithful, we're not saying that anyone here should go against Christian principles ever. That's our highest calling. But I think when we're able to interact with these governments in a humble and faithful way, they can see Christ in us. And we can be very hopeful that could have long-ranging implications, not only for the governments, but for their eternal futures.
So what are the challenges then when working with government and trying to establish combine our Christian principles and our heart for mission? What are the challenges that we can face in doing that? Have you got any practical examples that you could share? Where
This question was not on the list.
Only a few minutes, because we one or two other little areas as well. Because there are positives and there are successes, like we've just been talking about, but there are also challenges.
Yeah, I think especially when we're talking about international settings where we're not local or native born, attempting to provide an understanding of what is best practice, what is good and what is healthy for a child's development, particularly related to brain development, even when some of these ideas that a psychologist might provide here in America might not be heard or believed. And I'll take a step further, and sometimes this upsets people, but a lot of times even in our culture as Christians, many Christians don't believe in mental health care. Many Christians don't believe that our brains have differences and that our brains can be radically impacted in utero through neglect, through trauma, through hearing trauma. And so when we're trying to provide information, and it's not because someone isn't as educated or doesn't know as much or can't understand, but it's a newness. It's something that's new. And even in my small 15 years of experience of being a secularly trained clinical psychologist and a woman who is also a Christian, I will tell you here, even in America, that is a hard understanding for people to wrap their heads around. And so in different cultures and different settings, it can be very hard to try and understand what is the operational definition of best for a child. Is best for a child simply food, shelter, and survival? Or is best for a child, could best for a child also be holistic care? Could that also include not just safety and not just shelter and not just food, but also mental health, psychological health, and for those of us in Christ, faith development and spiritual health? And so those have been, in my experience, some of the more difficult conversations to have of just integrating what is holistic health for a child.
Specifically in trying to we transitioned from long-term residential care to family-based care, and we've continued to run in partnership with the government a very small emergency shelter for victims of trafficking and abuse. They're referred to us from the government, and the goal is to keep them as short as possible and to find them foster families. The issue with any kind of institutional care is that it always takes longer. And we work with the government and trying to get things through and trying to get them to do their part. I see this in child welfare in the US. I see this like everywhere. Child welfare is not highly prioritized, and things get put on the back burner or they get put through bureaucracy. And it's just difficult to move things along, and you think, well, there's the solution right there. But it has to go through all these different chains, and you have to rely on this chain, this person in this chain, and this person. And so you just see this slowdown, and in that child's mind, a day is forever, and it's so much longer in their head, and it's really impactful for them, and there's trauma involved. But what we've seen, so with our shelter, we want to really transition, even phase that out and do emergency foster care and equip emergency foster carers. And we have a few of those, but we want to be able to really transition and completely move the shelter out. Because our shelter is run in partnership with the government, it's so interesting because we've been doing training with the government, and we've been training these other orphanages, these other shelters in the area. We've become a part of this pilot program where our national director is doing a lot of training and exposing them to family-based care. And, you know, we have these people in government that are advocates for it. But then when we go, we proposed a plan for doing emergency foster care, and it was the weirdest conversation. They said it didn't go well, and they just didn't. Even after all of this time that we've been working together and we think they really get it, they explained how that wouldn't work and how it wouldn't be possible to do, how families just wouldn't be able to do that. We wouldn't be able to equip them enough, that families wouldn't be prepared to take in children on an emergency basis. And so we're still pursuing that, but I think there's a lot of mindset shift that still has to change. And even though there's so many people talking about it and there's a lot of great research, it's not fully embraced or understood, even by the people that are that are doing the actual deinstitutionalization. A lot of them may not even understand all of the different all of the different dynamics around that and what's important to keep in mind and how that is actually done. And so I think it's just it's a big undertaking. So I think it's going to be difficult with the government in doing it, but I think it's also very much worth it for these children because it's their entire life. So.
Can I just say, Ashley, you mentioned, are you Ashley or Ellie or Jason? Either. You mentioned just a phrase there, changing mindsets. It's something I really believe in passionately, that what we're doing is changing generational mindsets. And changing generational mindsets is going to take a generation or more to do it. And that is a journey to get there. So it's, as the journey started, I believe, yes, it has. Is it going to face challenges? Yes, it will, because not only is it just national, it's international, cross-cultural, inevitably. But changing mindsets takes time. But the journey has to be gone. Out of small acorns comes large oak trees. Jason.
Finding the balance between establishing yourself and supporting the system if you have the opportunity. So if you have the opportunity to do trainings for Department of Social Welfare and Development, how much of your resource and your time do you put into training them in clinical care when their shelters may be full and over capacity, and they may be doing all case management and don't have time, that's what's said, right? So how much time do you do like just providing clinical care, or how much do you train in capacity for the government? And so that's, if you take a long-term view of that, you may be thinking that actually the better investment is training the government, and yeah, but if you're running an organization, how do you balance that for yourself? So
Brilliant. I love that.
Real quickly, just looking at people like Ashley, your organization, and others that have been really having success, there's two things I know about the people working there. One is they're willing to kind of recognize the patience needing, as we've highlighted. The things are not going to move quickly. But also this humility that allows you to lift up the government officials. And it's a humility, though, that's backed up by confidence that this is Christ's work and that you're participating in that you can give credit to the government, you can raise them up, you can even, compliment them when you're gritting your teeth about things you're frustrated about, and really taking a humble approach, recognizing that this is God's work and that's okay to be that way.
Brilliant.
So back to the question about challenges, I would highlight one overarching theme here that I see around the world. I think, especially when working with governments, one of the hardest things, but the most fundamental, is allowing them to grasp the entire vision. Because transition is a process and not an event. So if we take this to the place of not just global mission, but moving towards family, which is, kind of at the crux of, I think, this panel, and all of us on this panel are advocates of that. Because it's a process and not an event, because they may have different capacities and experience and history with hope and logical thinking and disempowerment and colonialism and ideas about what is and is not possible. I think one of the most frustrating challenges for me is when organizations or governments are moving in the right direction, but they've taken one step and decide this is better, so it's good enough. Yeah. And it's not good enough, because it's an unending journey. It will never be, until kids are 100% around the world thriving, which we may not see in our lifetime, but it could happen, miracles do happen. Unless and until we see that, it is this journey of constant movement and improvement. And I think people are so tired, they're so poured out, that when we kind of crawl into their shoes, we can see why they get to a point of just thinking, we've made an improvement, isn't that sufficient? So I think keeping up the motivation, helping them to attach to that long-term vision that this is possible and they are part of it, is sometimes one of the greater challenges from my perspective.
I'm moving on, but I would love to continue this, but as they often say, we don't have the time. I'm looking, are we okay for time still? Who's my time sheet? Okay. I'm supposed to have been attributed to this statement. I'm not, but I've often said it. And it actually goes slightly against a little bit of what we saw in the film where we're talking about the orphan crisis. Yeah. And I've often said there isn't an orphan crisis, there's a family preservation crisis, which actually twists it the other way around. And I think the film was getting at that, even though they used in the early stages the phrase of an orphan crisis. And the orphan crisis is something that many people use, and it's like an attraction. It's like the phrase itself means something, or you think it means something, and that's exactly where you go for the orphan crisis without taking in everything else that comes with it, and even where those crises originate from. And they originate mostly from family. Mm-hmm. So we'll talk a little bit about that later when I talk about my book a little bit later. But okay, is there an orphan crisis, or is there a family preservation crisis, or how do you see that in your roles?
Well, we'll send it back this way. I will just talk about it straight from the data, because there is limited data. There is no global statistic on status of children in alternative care. About 7 years ago, maybe, we created a document through the Christian Alliance for Orphans called On Understanding Orphan Statistics. And we actually are in the final stages of revising sort of a Part B. It's called Status of Children in Alternative Care. So we've seen two things come out of that. As we look at the local data, which is the only actual empirical data there is no global data. We're seeing between 60 and 90% of children in residential care often have a living parent. Now, we do make the argument that doesn't necessarily always mean that living parent can care for them, and I think everyone can understand why that is. Almost 100% of kids in foster care have a living parent that even with support maybe can't care for them. However, there are a huge portion of them who could be cared for in other ways. On the flip side of it, we do have some data, again, not global but local, on what is the status of care for kids who are double orphans or who have lost both parents. And numbers vary between about 91 and 96% of those kids are being cared for in kinship situations. So those numbers don't line up, right? When we look at number of kids in care versus kind of the true orphans or double orphans. So I think the terminology is simply, it's obviously inappropriate. And I'll allow the rest of the panel to kind of comment to why that might be, but just from the number standpoint, that's what we see from the actual data.
I have like numbers right here that I'm not going to say because you did good overview. But I think that the real question following that, if it's not orphans who are in orphanages, or I would even say the kids who are living separate from parental care aren't actual, by definition, orphans, then what are they? What are the root causes of their separation? And that is an incredibly important question. And it's not one we can answer here. You have to answer it in your local setting because it is unique to the situation that the families are facing in that community. But I think it is a really important question as you're going out and engaging others to first recognize, and people will push back, these kids, believe me, we talk to a lot of people. All y'all say it. These kids are real orphans. We only take the orphans. I'm like, okay, so everybody out there only takes the real tough situations. And I think it's just important that we can be humble and recognize there's something to learn, because I've seen people go from that and really believing that these kids really don't, and then getting a couple kids they know grandma does visit, and getting to the point where they're surprised that all but one child is able to go home to their family. So let's hold that loosely. I think it's something we tell our donors, or it's something we receive as donors. We want to know that we're helping the most vulnerable kids, but I think it is something we need to question. And I think Sarah Gazarek, who's going to be at lunch, I think, she used to be the executive director of Faith to Action before I was, and she talks about, the Bible talks about caring for orphans, not keeping them orphans. And orphanhood is something we should be seeking to overcome. And I mean orphanhood not in a definition of having lost a parent, but being separated from a child. And that's a terminology that is making more sense in the U.S. right now, because we talk about children separated at the border. That's in the news all the time. When we start talking about these children are actually separated from family, not necessarily orphaned. I think that helps us kind of understand this kind of confusing terminology. And I think the other thing is we just have this mentality. People who are living their life, they're technical experts in other places. They hear the problem is orphans. I hear orphans is the problem. The orphanage is the answer. Even those words go together. But really recognizing that if the problem is orphanhood, then the answer is family, and the need for that connection and belonging that we know can only be provided in the family. So, yeah. I get excited, sorry.
That's great. I think a lot of it goes back to, it exposes our value system. And I think anybody who's done fundraising for a nonprofit knows that the orphan is going to attract more money than the family is. And in our value system, like in our own lives, when something breaks that's of low value, we get rid of it, we replace it. The only time that we repair something that breaks is when we hold it in really high value. And for the longest time, poor families, in our mindsets, poor families do not have value. They are not the priority. We see the issues of neglect or poverty and the issues that could be affecting those children, and we just want to get rid of the family. Let's just replace it. And we think if we do this big box care where the kids are all safe and we can take good pictures, these kids are better. They're going to be healthy, they're going to be happy, and we've just replaced the problem. We fixed it by removing it. And so I think what has to shift is that family has to be valued. What we're not looking at is the neurological value to those children. And that is their biggest value, is their family and their connection to their family. And so I think we have to really, in our messaging, whether it attracts donor dollars or not, we have to be honest with the fact that actually what those children need is family. Actually, that's where they're going to thrive, and that removing that family is not going to help that child. And so I think we have to be accountable to that and not use these terms to get funding, but really focus on what is it that that child needs. And like you said, when a child is an orphan, they need a family. And I think that's just the mindset that we do have to shift.
Could just have like a couple of minutes, 1 minute, 2 minutes each, because I'm being told at the back we're running out of time. I could go on all day with this, but yeah, yeah, easily.
So in the Philippines, the online sexual exploitation is generally a case where a parent is a perpetrator of sexual abuse in partnership with someone who is in a remote location, and the child is in a live chat room for that situation. So the child is taken from the family, and we're really in the early stages of research. So it's not this isn't scientific at this point. It's not empirical. It's being learned as we go. But what keeps being said time after time is that the children are staying oftentimes with other children who have experienced other types of abuse, and they seem to be not showing a lot of signs of trauma. They seem to internalize when they do show signs of trauma, but it's not as intense. And in fact, the trauma that they express over and over again is the separation from their parents. Every day they're praying to be back with their parents. I am not saying there's no trauma there. I think there definitely is, and I think it'll probably grow as we go. But we can't underestimate the impact of separation from parents. It's right up there.
Massive. 1 minute?
1 minute?
1 minute? I'm sorry, Karen.
I think I could talk for about 4 hours on this.
Yeah, I know.
I think one of the things that hit me with this documentary, and I haven't seen it before, and it's a great documentary on some levels, on many levels. But one of the things, and I could be wrong, but maybe not, I think when people are going to watch this documentary and they see the little girl from China, I think most people, especially Americans, and I would say Christians, will see that and will think, I can parent that girl. She could be my child. I can help that little girl. We can do this. We could bring her to America. We can pay for that surgery. And that's the mindset that comes first. It's not what would be best for this little girl.
Absolutely.
How can we help keep this little girl in her culture? And what we see is that she is being loved well by a family. You could see the markers of attachment and connection and love with that little girl and her foster mom, who is now her mommy. And so I think it's a mindset, and I think what Ashley said is on point. It's a value. What are we valuing the most? And I think that when we think about vulnerable children, when we think about children who may be orphaned or who are separated from their families, I think it's a crucial and an essential moment for us as individuals to take a good hard look inside and say, what is this serving for me? And what am I most valuing? Am I valuing what's good for me and what might be helpful, or what might people give me accolades about? Or am I viewing the situation with this vulnerable family or this vulnerable child, am I viewing it from a place of what is going to be the best and the healthiest holistically for this child or this teenager or that family?
I just, 1 minute, that boy, the Brazilian boy on the film, if you read one statement and he said, the phrase came, I'd love to be able to be at home with my mum. Yeah? No one had asked him that question. And if they had, and if they had the resources, they would have gone looking for the mother. And eventually, guess what? He found her. Because he goes back to her and starts looking after her in the favela, which means they knew all along. What is wrong with us when we can't actually summon up the resources and the intent and the desire to help the mother look after the child when that's what he wanted all along? And yet he finished up in England. We know it, and I guess it's the same in the States when you look at research. Most of the kids come out of government care at 18 and go where? Go back to their family. That's where they go. And often it doesn't work because they're so disconnected. disorientated because they've never lived and survived and related with each other, with one another. Family is crucial. Family is important. It may not always work. It may not always be the best for some children, but it's certainly something that we've got to look at and certainly put our resources and our focus in with the churches and our donors, because that's the crucial thing. You want to add to that
Every
quickly?
time we've seen really successful transitions, which I try to learn about it, and I don't know, I can't think of an exception of the people I've talked to in the last 4 years. There is a moment where their staff shifts from, my job is to care for these kids, to my job is to care for families and these parents. And if that can happen, and they can shift their ministry to recognizing, like, I'm going to start praying for mom and dad. I'm going to start caring for them. Magic happens.
Brilliant. Listen, time to go. There's another one coming up shortly. I've enjoyed this. Don't know about you guys, but this wasn't planned. This is completely off the cuff. But I hope you've got some stuff out of that session. Thank you very much.